Welcome to the another session of Angular tutorial. In this session, we are going to discuss high-level architecture of Angular. We are going to discuss different building blocks of Angular application like module, component, services, and then at the end we are going to talk about how the application is bootstrapped by exploring our Hello World application that we designed in our last session. Now that we know that Angular is a front-end application framework which is used to build web application, we need to understand how the Angular creates the application in a new way. Prior to Angular, the front end is built up by using the combination of HTML, JavaScript along with CSS to enhance the presentation. Architecture of Angular is drastically different than what you know. The core parts of Angular application development are modules, component, and the services. We will explore each of these building blocks to understand their significance in Angular app development. To do this, let us first understand what is module. We will be also discussing the role of module, what is root module, and basic use of module. Every Angular application is modular and it has its own modular system called as ng-module. Every Angular application is a collection of different modules which can interact with each other. Creation of such distinct independent modules helps in managing the complex application development and also it increases the reusability. By default, every Angular application has one root module which is called as app module. This module is defined in the file appmodule.ts. This module acts as a container for all other modules in your application. Every module is a class which contains declaration of components, directives, services which can be exported to other modules. Of course, you can decide not to choose few of the elements based on your design of applications. So let us try to understand the module definition. Look at the sample module shown on the screen. The first thing that you might have noticed that the module is importing the browser module. This is built-in module in Angular. You need to import this module so that you can able to use basic directives, pipes and services of Angular. While defining a module in Angular, you need to provide metadata information to the module. One of the important things that you should do is to decorate the module with ng-module. ng-module is a decorator which consists of a function which generates a single metadata object of the properties based on which the module is built. ng-module decorator requires at least 3 properties such as imports, declaration, and bootstrap. There are also other properties like exports, providers, etc. Let us explore all these properties one by one. The imports property declares the list of the other modules whose exported classes are to be used by the components that are the part of the current module. Providers declares the list of the service creators that the current ng-module contributes. They are available to all parts of the application. Declarations are the property which declares the array which contains components, directives and pipes which belongs to the current module. Export property contains the subset of declarations which you are permitting to be visible or usable in the other components of ng-module. And lastly and most importantly, bootstrap declares the main view of application which is termed as root component. This root component acts as a container for all other views. Note that only one root module, that is app module, should set up the bootstrap, as bootstrap defines the starting component of your application. The other type of models, which is termed as feature model, can have the components, but they cannot bootstrap the application. We will be discussing about how to create feature model in our later sessions. Now you might be wondering that why the app component is declared twice in this model. First, we have declared that in the declaration as well, then we have declared it again in the bootstrap. Well, there is a reason for that. Firstly, as this is the root model, we must define the root component in the bootstrap declaration array. And in the declaration, as we said, we list out those components or pipes which are used in our application. So we need to declare the app component in the declaration array as well. Understanding the model is the most important phase for learning Angular. So before we proceed, let us revise the model graphically. Every model in Angular can declare the components directive pipes which are part of the current model. They provide services to the other application components. They can import the other models as well, and each model can export to the other models as well. Once we understand models, let us now discuss the next important building block of Angular, that is component. We will be discussing what is component, how to declare component, and metadata of component. Technically speaking, component is a TypeScript class decorated with @component. As component represents the view, inside @component decorator, you have to define the metadata as selector, template, and style. To understand the component better, have a look at the sample component declaration. You can see a class named as app component. Remember that this app component is a component which was declared in ng module just couple of minutes back. This app component has a @component decoration below which some metadata information is declared. The first property is selector. This property tells Angular to create and insert the instance of this component at the location where this tag is written in the template HTML. So in our case, wherever app root is observed by Angular in template URL, that is app component.html, the instance of this class will be created and inserted. Well, what class has to do with the HTML content? Which contents of the object and how those contents are displayed in HTML? Do not panic at this moment. We will be discussing this in our upcoming sessions where we will be creating components and using them. The second property is template URL. Template URL is a path of an external URL of HTML file for component, which means that if the selector is observed, this HTML file is loaded. Alternatively, you can also use inline HTML by using template property instead of template URL. Of course, it is normally not recommended as most of the times our HTML page would be complex and will be containing few tags, and putting them in a line would be a bit complicated. The third property is style URL. Style URL defines the path of external CSS file which you can apply to your template of component. Instead of giving the external path, you can also add the inline style property as style for each component separately. The point to note here is that all the style elements designed in one component are not applied to other component. That means they cannot be inherited to other components. There are other properties of @component decorators which we will be discussing later. The third important building block of Angular application is service. We will be discussing what is service, how to declare service, and how to utilize service. Often in an application, no matter what kind of application we build, we come across situation where we need to use code at multiple locations. Such code is generally not repeated everywhere but declared in a way so that it will be utilized by everybody. Such an approach in programming is called as separation of concern. This is achieved by services in Angular. Service is a class in Angular with well-defined purpose. It will have some function to serve which will be utilized by component. To create a class as a service, you need to decorate it with @injectable. Let us look at the sample service here. The service hello world service is decorated with @injectable, which says that you can inject this service in components. When the application is bootstrapped, Angular creates application-wide injectors for the component. Injectable decorator has one property provided in, which is set up to true. The provided in property, when set to root, the service becomes singleton object. There is another way, of course, to make the service as singleton. If you include the services directly in the app module, then it becomes the singleton object. Once you define service, the next step is to use this service in the component. To do this, you need to acquire the object of service from the constructor of the component. Take a note of TypeScript syntax here. Once you get the object, you can utilize the business logic from this particular method. We have defined the basic building blocks of Angular. Before we proceed further, let us have a quick recap of Angular architecture again. Every Angular app consists of one or more multiple modules which communicates with each other. Every Angular app consists of modules. Along with that, it communicates with component to represent view. The component essentially consists of selectors, which defines tag, template, and the CSS. The component can communicate to service where the business logic resides. With all these discussions, we will go back to our Hello World application and understand the structure of application. As you know, to create application of Angular, you need to give the command ng-new. ng-new command installs all the dependencies that are required for your application, which you can observe in package.json. Package.json lists you different dependencies which are present in your application, like Angular compiler, Angular core, Angular forms, and much more things. ng-new command generates a structure of application for development as well as end-to-end testing. The development related files can be seen in the src folder, while the end-to-end testing related file can be seen in E2E folder, which we'll be discussing later on. But at this moment, it is important to understand the file structure of the development. If you explore src, you will see the different folders like app, asset, and environment. App is basically a folder which is created for app module, which is a root module for all the Angular applications. The app module class defined in the TypeScript file as appmodule.ts. The component app component, which is declared in app module, is defined in app component class, which is defined in another TS file, which is appcomponent.ts. Of course, you need to have bit practice to understand the file naming conventions to avoid the confusions. For example, if you create the module employee, then the generated class name for this module will be employee module. If you create the component employee detail, then the generated class name for this component will be employee detail component. Then there are another two files which are present, which is called as appcomponent.ts, appcomponent.html, which defines the structure for your HTML when the view gets rendered, and appcomponent.cs, which defines style for your view. It is very interesting to know the execution of Angular which follows after ng-serve. The first thing which happens after ng-serve command is it goes to the file called as angular.json. Angular.json defines index file and main file. When the main file gets loaded, when the index file gets loaded via main, it goes to the different modules which are available. The index.html file defines app root, which is basically present into our app module or app component. So it goes to the root module, which is nothing but app. Inside that, it goes to appcomponent.ts and finds the selector app root, and then it loads appcomponent.html. Oh, there are a lot of files present and there is a lot of stuff. You wouldn't have expected Hello World application to be so much complicated, right? But trust me, as you proceed further, you will be understanding the structure in more and more simpler way and will be able to understand the structure of Angular in detail. So, we have just identified Hello World app and the different important files and folders which are present in Hello World app. In our next session, we will be discussing how to create the component and what are the details of the component.